Alright, so in the previous video I gave you kind of a high-level view of primary and secondary sources and also the process that we go through when we interact with them, read them, interpret them. And so in this one I want to delve more deeply into exactly how you read them and interpret them.
The important part of interpretation is the ability to ask questions of something, just like I've talked about more broadly that historians ask questions. Well, you also ask questions of sources when you are reading them or viewing them, however you're interacting with that source. Most of the time you're reading it when it comes to primary sources, but let's think about it more broadly. And so I have another example here of a primary source. This is a Devanagari manuscript, or actually manuscripts, and it's just a good example of something that would involve someone interpreting this for me, but in the sense of translation. So when we think about translation from one language to another, maybe you have heard of the saying lost in translation. So something that when it's translated is not quite the same idea or connotation or suggestion as it was in the original language. So it's a situation of where meaning can be lost. This can also take place when you're thinking about translation in time periods. So when you're looking at something that was created a long time ago, or even 10, 20 years ago, it's part of a different time and a different culture. And so again, some things can be lost in translation. So some of the ways that we try to overcome that challenge is to not only think about the level of bias that we talked about in the previous video, but also that we are careful what kinds of questions that we're asking when we're looking at how to read a primary source or how to view a primary source. I like the paper method. This was created by Patrick Rail. And so there's 5 different steps of this. First, thinking about the purpose and the motivations of the author, and then thinking about the argument and the strategy that they use to achieve their goals. And then they're also thinking about presuppositions and also their values. And so one way to think about this is that whatever assumptions that you or the source have before they even wrote it or you came and read it. And so it's not just the source, but also your own assumptions or presuppositions and values. And then there's epistemology, and this is just really a big word for evaluating the truth in content. And then lastly, relating it to other texts. So you're comparing and contrasting it to other sources. This could be secondary sources, primary sources, or both. So first, let's talk about purpose. One of the first questions you should be asking is, who is the author? Another part of that is, what's their place in society? So you want to explain why you're justified in thinking who they are and where their place is. But part of that, knowing that, is being able to assess reliability and credibility, which we'll talk about a little bit later here. That's an important part of that. But we also need to know what's at stake for the author and the source. Sometimes something is low stakes for them or very high stakes. For instance, if this was something that they were writing or creating as part of a murder trial, and the stakes would be their life if they're in a place in a time with a death sentence, for instance. And so you think about those stakes, high or low. And then also, why do you think that they wrote or created that source? And then you want to provide evidence for your views in that. Also, does the author have a thesis or an argument? And what is that thesis or argument? That leads us to argument. How does the source make its case? This is a view of, how is that structured? Sometimes that's really important as far as thinking about the ways that you interpret a source. So part of that is the intended audience for it and how that might have influenced what kind of strategies they're using, the rhetorical strategy or the way that they are creating something or talking about it. And then going back to who they are, but as part of the argument, do you think that the author is credible and reliable? If they're not credible and reliable, how much should you believe their argument? That's an important thing to consider. Let's go to presuppositions, or what kinds of assumptions that are made. And an important part of this is, how do you think the ideas and values in the source might have differed from the ideas and values of our current age? This is important because of the next step. What kind of assumptions, preconceptions, presuppositions that you are bringing to this source? For instance, there may be things in the source that you find objectionable that people of the time or contemporaries might have found acceptable. For instance, slavery is an example of something that, for good reason, we find utterly abhorrent or terrible. And however, you are reading or viewing something, and maybe people of the time would have found that acceptable. And so it's not necessarily that you have to agree with them, but you do need to know the difference between where you're at and your presuppositions and preconceptions and theirs, as far as who is creating that historical source or their contemporaries as well. Also, you need to think about how your differences between your values and the values of the author are going to influence the way that you understand them. For instance, if it is something about they're writing about slavery in support of it, and you strongly believe that it is terrible, how is that influencing the way that you're able to understand that source? Because sometimes we have to think about understanding and not necessarily always agreement. All right, so let's think about the next step as far as epistemology, or again, a big word for evaluating the truth in content. So think about how this source is supported by arguments that you found in secondary sources. And again, secondary sources are those who are written by experts. They are using a number of different primary sources to give you an idea of the broader context, and also have done some of that comparison for you. And you also want to think about the types of information that the text or the source is telling you without knowing that it's telling you. Or another way to think about it is, what can you read between the lines and find? Or maybe this is something that the author doesn't want to reveal but does anyway. Think about those things. And the last one is you relating it to other texts or sources. So think about the patterns or ideas that are repeated throughout sources. Sometimes you're just reading one source, but often when you are assigned readings in history courses, you're giving sources that are talking about the similar event but in very different ways. And so that's some of the ways that you can think about those patterns and differences. What are those major differences? And who, as far as which one do you find more reliable and credible? When you talk about which one you find more reliable and credible, you have to make sure that you're using evidence. Evidence is really important for all of these steps. And you'll notice that reliability and credibility have come up in 3 different areas for this. When we talk about the different areas, if we think about the different steps of this, the purpose and motivations, reliability and credibility are part of that, what strategies they're using, what presuppositions they have or what assumptions they're making, credibility, reliability, big part of that, and again, how you're relating it, you're comparing it, contrasting it to other sources as well. And so, again, these are the steps. This breaks it down in a way that you can do it question by question, but it's getting at the major areas that you need to focus on when you're thinking about reading or viewing primary sources.